Picture this. You are standing on the banks of the Nile 13,000 years ago. There is no Egypt yet. No pyramids, no pharaohs, nothing you would recognize as civilization. Just reeds, water, fish, and a small group of people who have been living here for generations, doing what humans have always done, which is figuring out how to eat tomorrow. And then one day, they don't die of old age or a crocodile bite or a bad fish bone stuck in the throat. They die because another group of humans walked up and put sharpened stone into their bodies, on purpose, more than once, in a pattern that looks less like an accident and a lot more like a message. This is Jebel Sahaba, and it might be the oldest evidence we have of humans doing something that feels almost too modern for the Stone Age. War. Now here's the question that keeps anthropologists up at night, fuels bar arguments among archaeology nerds, and honestly makes for one of the most fascinating rabbit holes in the study of human nature. When did we start doing this? When did a species that spent millions of years just trying to survive predators, find food, and not freeze to death, turn around and decide that the best use of its time was to organize, plan, and kill members of its own species in groups? Because here's the thing that should bother you a little. War is not like eating or sleeping. It is not an instinct you're born with in the same way hunger is. It requires cooperation on a terrifying scale. You need people to agree on a plan. You need them to trust each other enough to walk into danger together. You need someone to say, let's go kill those people over there, and have a group of other people go, yeah, okay, let's do that. That is a weirdly organized, weirdly social behavior for something so destructive. Chaos doesn't need a plan. War does. So today we're going digging, literally through tens of thousands of years of bones, skulls, arrowheads, and mass graves to figure out when exactly our ancestors crossed that line. And I promise you, the answer is messier, older, and stranger than you'd expect. Let's start with the obvious contender for humanity's most annoying debate. Are humans naturally peaceful or naturally violent? You've probably heard both sides. Somebody at a dinner party will tell you humans are inherently violent, it's in our DNA. Look at chimpanzees. They do it too. And then somebody else will say, no, actually, early humans were peaceful, cooperative foragers, and war is a disease of agriculture and civilization, a symptom of greed and property, not something baked into us. This argument has a name, sort of. It's the Hobbes versus Rousseau debate, named after two philosophers who never actually studied archaeology but somehow got assigned as the official mascots of this fight anyway. Thomas Hobbes said life without government was nasty, brutish, and short, basically arguing humans are violent by default and only civilization keeps us in check. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said the opposite, that humans were basically decent until society corrupted us with property and inequality. Both of these guys died a couple hundred years before anyone found a Stone Age mass grave, so really they were just guessing. Educated guessing, sure, but guessing. The actual answer had to wait for people willing to get dirt under their fingernails. So let's look at what the dirt says. Our species, Homo sapiens, has been around for roughly 300,000 years, depending on which fossil find you want to argue about this week. For the overwhelming majority of that time, we were small groups of hunter-gatherers, moving around, living in bands that were probably somewhere between 20 and 50 people. Extremely small numbers. You'd know literally everyone in your world. There was no the enemy nation. There was maybe that other group we sometimes see near the good berry bushes. For a shockingly long stretch of prehistory, we don't have great evidence of organized group violence. We have evidence of individual violence, sure. Someone gets murdered, someone gets a skull fracture from a fight, someone gets stabbed by a rival. Interpersonal violence is old, really old. But that's different from war. War implies groups, implies planning, implies an us and a them at a scale bigger than just two guys fighting over a woman or a piece of meat. The tricky part of this whole investigation is that skeletons don't come with little signs saying died in tribal warfare or died because my cousin was drunk and stabbed me. Archaeologists have to look at patterns. Are multiple people buried together, all showing signs of violent death at roughly the same time? Are the wounds consistent with weapons rather than accidents? Are there embedded projectile points, like actual arrowheads still stuck in bone? Is there evidence of defensive wounds, meaning people who tried to block an attack? These are the clues that turn "a person died violently" into "this looks like combat, possibly organized." And this is where Jebel Sahaba comes back into the story, because it's one of the best, oldest, and most argued about pieces of evidence we have. Jebel Sahaba is a cemetery site in what is now Sudan, discovered back in the 1960s. It contains around 61 individuals, and a huge chunk of them, somewhere around 40% by some estimates, show signs of violent death. We're talking embedded stone projectile points in bones, fractures consistent with blows, and wounds on men, women, and children alike. This wasn't a battlefield where soldiers fought soldiers. This looks like entire communities being targeted, which is honestly one of the more disturbing details once it sinks in. For decades, this site was dated to around 13,000 years ago and treated as basically a single horrific massacre, a snapshot of one very bad day. But more recent research, and this is where the story gets a genuinely interesting plot twist, suggests something different. Newer analysis indicates the deaths at Jebel Sahaba didn't all happen at once. Instead, it looks like this was a place where violence happened repeatedly over a long period, maybe generations, rather than a single catastrophic event, which honestly might be even more unsettling. It's not one horrific incident. It's a pattern. A community living with the ongoing threat and reality of violent conflict as a normal part of existence, generation after generation. Why would this have been happening around this time and place? Context matters here, and the context is climate. This period, the end of the Pleistocene, was a time of serious environmental instability in Northeast Africa. The Nile Valley was going through dramatic shifts, sometimes flooding, sometimes drying, and populations that depended on fishing and foraging along the river would have been squeezed into smaller and smaller viable territory during the bad stretches. When resources get scarce and populations are stuck along a narrow, resource-rich strip of land with nowhere else to go, competition intensifies. And when competition intensifies among groups of humans who already have weapons designed for killing large animals, well, you can see where this is going. This is actually one of the leading theories for why organized violence emerges at all. Not that humans are simply born killers waiting for an excuse, but that specific ecological pressures, especially resource scarcity, combined with population circumscription, meaning you're boxed in and can't just wander off somewhere else, create the conditions where group conflict becomes a rational, if horrifying, strategy for survival. But Jebel Sahaba isn't alone. Let's talk about Nataruk. Nataruk is a site near Lake Turkana in Kenya, and this one is a genuine gut punch of a find. Discovered more recently, dated to around 10,000 years ago, it contains the remains of at least 27 individuals found in what was once the shore of a lagoon. 10 of these skeletons were relatively complete, and the majority of those show clear signs of a violent death. We're talking a projectile point still lodged in a skull, blunt force trauma, fractured hands which might indicate defensive wounds, bound wrists on at least one individual, suggesting this person might have been restrained. What makes Nataruk so significant is the context. This wasn't a burial site. These bodies were not carefully interred. They appear to have been left where they fell along the lagoon shore and then naturally preserved by the sediment. This looks like a group of people, potentially including men, women, and children, who were killed together in one violent event and never given any kind of formal burial afterward. The researchers who published this discovery argued it represents evidence of warfare among hunter-gatherers roughly 10,000 years ago, prior to the widespread adoption of agriculture in that region. And this detail matters enormously for the bigger debate, because one popular theory has always been that war is fundamentally tied to farming. The logic goes like this: hunter-gatherers don't have much worth stealing. They can just walk away from conflict. There's no fixed property, no stored grain, no permanent territory worth dying for. Once you start farming, though, you're stuck. You've got a field, a granary, a home you can't just abandon. Suddenly there's something worth defending, and something worth taking. Agriculture, in this theory, is basically the birth mother of warfare. Nataruk complicates that story significantly because these are hunter-gatherers, not farmers, engaging in what looks very much like intergroup violence. If this interpretation holds up, it pushes evidence for organized violence back before agriculture, suggesting the seeds, pun somewhat intended, of warfare were present in human behavior well before we ever planted a single crop. Now, I want to be fair here because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets contested in academic circles, and rightly so. Some researchers have pushed back on the Nataruk interpretation, suggesting alternative explanations for some of the trauma, or questioning whether this represents organized warfare in the sense of coordinated group conflict between distinct social groups versus a smaller scale violent event. Archaeology is not a courtroom with a final verdict. It's an ongoing argument where new evidence and new methods keep reshuffling the deck. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. That's honestly part of what makes it so fun to follow. So let's zoom out even further because 13,000 years and 10,000 years ago are, in the scope of human existence, actually pretty recent. Homo sapiens existed for hundreds of thousands of years before either of these sites. What about earlier? This is where things get hazy because bones from deep prehistory are rare, and the ones we have often don't preserve soft tissue wounds or give us enough context to say this was definitely combat versus this person had a rough encounter with a cave bear. But we do have some tantalizing and honestly kind of chilling hints. There's evidence of interpersonal violence going back remarkably far. Skulls with healed and unhealed fractures from blunt trauma appear across various early human and even pre-Homo sapiens sites. There's a famous case involving a Neanderthal skeleton with rib damage that some researchers argued came from a projectile weapon, though that particular interpretation has been challenged over the years, which, again, welcome to archaeology. The bigger issue with the deep past isn't whether violence existed. Violence almost certainly did because violence is ancient, arguably older than our species itself. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, engage in something disturbingly close to organized warfare. Groups of male chimps will patrol territorial borders, and if they encounter a smaller group or lone individual from a rival community, they don't just posture and back off the way you might expect from an ordinary dominance display. They will sometimes launch a coordinated, brutal attack and kill the intruder. Researchers who've spent decades observing chimpanzee communities, going back to Jane Goodall's original observations at Gombe in the 1970s, have documented what looks remarkably like small-scale intergroup warfare, complete with what appears to be planning, patrolling, and opportunistic lethal violence. This matters a lot for our question because chimpanzees and humans share a common ancestor that lived somewhere around 6 or 7 million years ago. If both chimps and humans engage in coordinated lethal intergroup violence, it raises the very uncomfortable possibility that the capacity for this behavior isn't something that emerged recently in human history, tied to farming or complex society, but instead is a deep evolutionary inheritance, something present in the behavioral toolkit long before Homo sapiens existed as a species at all. Now, before you spiral into thinking humans are just naked, less hairy chimps destined for violence, let's bring in the other side of the evolutionary story, because it's important. And honestly, it's the part people conveniently forget at parties. We also share a close evolutionary relationship with bonobos. Bonobos are just as closely related to us as chimpanzees are, and bonobo society looks almost nothing like chimpanzee society when it comes to conflict. Bonobos are famous, maybe over-famous at this point, for resolving tension through social bonding and cooperation rather than violence. Lethal intergroup aggression is essentially not observed in bonobo populations the way it is in chimps. So here's the actual honest answer to, are humans naturally violent or naturally peaceful? We descended from an ancestor that could have gone either direction, and somehow we ended up with the capacity for both extremes, often depending entirely on circumstances, culture, and environment. We can organize genocidal violence, and we can also organize elaborate systems of cooperation, trade, diplomacy, and peace treaties. The potential for both was probably always there, what determines which one shows up seems to depend heavily on the pressures a given group is facing. Let's bring this back to the archaeological record and fast forward a bit, because things get clearer, in a grim way, once we hit the transition to farming and settled life. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, in various parts of the world, independently, humans began domesticating plants and animals. This is the Neolithic Revolution, arguably the single biggest lifestyle change in the history of our species. And, almost immediately after settled agricultural life takes hold, the archaeological record starts showing us something new: fortifications, walls, ditches, palisades, weapon stockpiles clearly designed for use against other humans rather than animals. Mass graves that are unambiguous, no room for the "maybe this was an accident" interpretation that sometimes lingers around older, sparser evidence. One of the most famous and disturbing examples is the Talheim death pit in Germany, dated to around 7,000 years ago. This is a mass grave containing the remains of at least 34 individuals, men, women, and children, all showing signs of violent death, primarily from blows to the head consistent with stone adzes, a farming tool that doubles disturbingly well as a weapon. What's chilling about Talheim is the demographic pattern. This wasn't warriors killed in battle against other warriors. This looks like an entire settlement, wiped out, possibly in a single raid. There's a similar site in Austria called Schletz-Aspern, also around this time period, also showing evidence of mass killing of an entire farming community, including infants. And here's a detail that really sticks with people once they hear it. Analysis of the demographics at some of these sites shows an apparent shortage of young adult women among the victims, which has led some researchers to a dark hypothesis that these raids weren't just about killing rivals or seizing land, but also involved the abduction of women, a pattern that unfortunately shows up again and again throughout later, better documented history of warfare. This period, the early Neolithic, roughly 7 to 8,000 years ago in parts of Europe, is when the evidence for organized, brutal, group-on-group violence becomes about as unambiguous as prehistoric archaeology ever gets. And it lines up almost too perfectly with the theory that settled agricultural life, fixed territory, accumulated resources, and growing population density created exactly the conditions that make large-scale violence between communities not just possible, but apparently common. So where does this leave us on the actual question? When did ancient humans first go to war? If you want the boring, hedge-your-bets, academically responsible answer, it's this. We don't have a single clean starting point because the transition from individual violence to organized group warfare wasn't a light switch flipping on at one specific moment in history. It looks more like a gradient, one that existed within our evolutionary lineage possibly for millions of years in some primitive form that intensified and became more visible in the archaeological record as populations grew, as environments became more constrained, and as humans developed more settled, resource-dependent lifestyles. The sites at Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk suggest that hunter-gatherers, tens of thousands of years before agriculture, were already capable of organized, lethal, group-level violence under the right pressures, mainly environmental stress and resource competition. This pushes back against the tidy theory that war is simply an invention of farming and property. But then places like Talheim show that once agriculture does take hold, the scale, frequency, and brutality of organized violence seems to increase dramatically, supporting the idea that settled life with fixed resources absolutely intensifies the conditions for war, even if it didn't invent the capacity for it from scratch. Put those together, and you get a fascinating, slightly uncomfortable picture of human nature. The capacity for organized violence between groups appears to be ancient, likely predating our species, inherited from a common ancestor we share with chimpanzees. But whether that capacity gets expressed, and how often, and how brutally, seems to depend enormously on circumstances. Scarcity, population pressure, competition over fixed resources, being boxed into a limited territory with no easy escape. These conditions seem to act like a trigger, turning latent capacity into actual, documented mass violence. And honestly, there's something worth sitting with here because it flips the usual framing of this debate on its head a little. The question, are humans naturally violent or naturally peaceful, might just be the wrong question entirely. A more useful question might be, under what conditions does either behavior get switched on? Because the evidence increasingly suggests humans are neither reflexively violent nor reflexively peaceful by default. We're deeply, sometimes uncomfortably responsive to our circumstances. Give a group of humans stability, abundant resources, and room to spread out, and cooperation tends to win out because cooperation is simply a better survival strategy when there's enough to go around. Squeeze that same group into scarcity, competition, and existential pressure, and the darker side of our behavioral toolkit seems to activate disturbingly fast and disturbingly effectively. There's one more thread worth pulling here before we wrap up, and it's about why humans got so unnervingly good at organized violence once we started doing it. Because if you think about it, humans should, in theory, be terrible at war compared to a lot of other animals. We don't have claws built for killing. We don't have the raw bite force of a big predator. Individually, a human is not an especially dangerous animal. But we have something almost no other species has to this degree, and that's the ability to cooperate in large, coordinated groups with people who aren't necessarily close relatives, based on shared belief systems, symbols, and social bonds rather than pure kinship. This is actually one of the defining superpowers of our species, arguably more important to our success than any physical trait. And it turns out that superpower is a double-edged sword of the most literal kind. The same cooperative wiring that lets us build cities, trade networks, and civilizations is the same wiring that lets us build armies. Organized violence and organized society may share more of the same underlying social machinery than we'd like to admit. This is why war, when it does show up in the archaeological and historical record, so often looks disturbingly organized rather than chaotic. Coordinated ambushes, targeted raids at dawn when victims are most vulnerable, weapon stockpiles, fortifications built in anticipation of future conflict, not just reaction to a past one. This isn't the behavior of an animal driven purely by aggression in the moment. This is planning. This is strategy. And strategy requires exactly the kind of complex social cognition and cooperative trust that also lets humans build the incredible, genuinely beautiful things we're capable of. Art, language, cities, medicine, all of it running on the same underlying hardware. So when you ask when ancient humans first went to war, you're really asking when that hardware first got pointed in a destructive direction at scale. And the honest answer the evidence gives us is probably a very long time ago, in some form, possibly inherited from ancestors that weren't even fully human yet, and definitely, unambiguously, by at least 13,000 years ago at places like Jebel Sahaba, with the trend accelerating hard once agriculture locked us into fixed territories worth killing over. What I find genuinely haunting about all this evidence, sitting with it after going through site after site, isn't just the violence itself. It's the ordinariness of it. These weren't monsters in some mythological sense. These were people navigating brutal, resource-scarce circumstances with the same brains, the same capacity for love and cooperation and cruelty that we still carry around today. The line between the community that built a fishing settlement on the Nile and the community that later became capable of raiding it into oblivion isn't some evolutionary gap. It's circumstance. It's pressure. It's what happens when the conditions get bad enough that the darker end of our behavioral range gets pulled to the surface, which honestly should make us a little more humble and a little more careful about how quickly we assume we've evolved past all of it. Because the evidence doesn't say humans are inherently doomed to violence. It also doesn't say we're inherently peaceful creatures corrupted by civilization. What it says, if you actually listen to what tens of thousands of years of bones and battlefields are telling you, is that we are creatures of extraordinary range, capable of astonishing cooperation and astonishing cruelty, often depending on nothing more than whether there's enough food, enough land, and enough security to go around. The first war humans ever fought probably didn't have a name. There was no declaration, no treaty to break, no flag to plant. It was probably just a group of hungry, frightened, desperate people looking at another group of hungry, frightened, desperate people and deciding, under pressures we can only partially reconstruct from stone points and fractured bones, that violence was the answer that made sense that day. And the uncomfortable truth is that answer never fully went away. It just got older, more organized, and considerably better armed.